Iraqi Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi declared victory this week over the Islamic State in Mosul, where the terror group declared its so-called caliphate in 2014. But after a bloody three-year struggle there, my next guest says the fight is far from over. Seth Jones is the director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation and author of Waging Insurgent Warfare: Lessons from the Viet Cong to the Islamic State. So Seth Jones, welcome. Good to have you here.
Great to be on. Thanks, Paul.
So how significant for American interests, we know it matters a lot to the Iraqis, but how significant for American strategic interests is this liberation of Mosul?
Well, I do think it's important, and I think it is important to note that the U.S. strategy changed quite a bit in the 2003, 4, 5 period, and all the way up through the surge. The U.S. did a chunk of this kind of clearing with U.S. Marine or Army forces. In this case, the U.S. supported Iraqi counterterrorism forces, Kurdish militia, and unfortunately some Shia in the area. So it was done much better, I think, this time.
So why do you say unfortunately some Shia? Because that's really Iranian front groups and militias.
Yeah, well, and the number of Iranian, the amount of Iranian support here and the number of Shia militia in Iraq is staggering right now. Almost 150,000 popular mobilization units. That's pretty significant, and actually shows how much influence Iran has in Iraq right now.
All right. Well, now the campaign against Islamic State also making progress inside Syria, where the fall of Raqqa, their headquarters in Syria, could also be heading that way. Is that victory, that liberation, imminent too?
It's probably not imminent. I think if the liberation of Mosul tells us anything, it's Raqqa and some of the villages and cities that sit south along the Euphrates River Valley are going to be brutal fights. They're going to be filled with car bombs, suicide bombers, children that are being used as shields in the fighting. I think it's likely to be intense. But I think in the end, the Americans are likely to prevail with their local allies and remove most of ISIS from these towns and villages, including Raqqa. Okay,
so let's assume that liberation does take place. You've written for us this week that already the jihadists from Islamic State are spreading out, returning essentially to their insurgent strategy, blending into villages, smaller towns, waiting for another opportunity to regroup, and no doubt committing terror along the way. What has to happen on the part of the Iraqi government and the U.S. to make sure that ISIS doesn't revive?
Well, I think at the core, we have to remember that this is primarily, it's a political struggle going on, not a military one. And if we look at some of the Anbar cities like Fallujah and Ramadi, Fallujah was cleared by the U.S. in 2003.
Right.
Then we had insurgents move back. It was recleared. The last decade and a half has been constantly reclearing some of these cities. So I think what has to happen is, in particular in Sunni areas, some of the key issues that have disenfranchised Sunnis have got to be better addressed. That is in part a heavy political effort by the U.S. and U.S. diplomats to push the Iraqi government. This is going to put it really at loggerheads with Iran to settle some of these Sunni disenfranchisement issues, and that is the large number of Shia militia, more rapid reconstruction in cities like Fallujah, now Mosul and Ramadi, and then to treat this as a political rather than just a military struggle.
So they can't seem to be, the Baghdad government with the Shiite forces that back Iran can't seem to be imposing a new kind of tyranny on those Sunni areas of Anbar province in Iraq, because that's the root, that's the base from which the insurgency grows.
That's an important base of support. If one looks at the rise of the Islamic State in 2014, certainly its ability to gain sanctuary in Syria was helpful, but also its ability to take advantage of grievances among the Sunni population, who identified their government in Baghdad as essentially an Iranian stooge, was a key component of ISIS actually getting into that area.
All right, so what would be your recommendation to the Trump administration about how to handle U.S. forces there? We've got several thousand that are on the ground there, mostly special forces, advisors, and targeters. But should we negotiate a more permanent presence there of the troops, 10,000 or so, of the kind that President Obama refused to do in 2011?
Yeah, I think there's no question right now the U.S. needs to recognize that Iraq does have a strategic importance for the United States. I don't think it requires a large number of U.S. conventional forces,
right,
but I do think it does require the U.S. to remain and have access to Iraqi bases, to continue to train Iraq's counterterrorism service, which was incredibly important in the retaking of Mosul and will be in the retaking of other cities, including Al-Qaim in Iraq, to continue to train Iraqi police forces, which will be the bedrock for law enforcement in Fallujah and Ramadi and other Sunni heavy cities in the future. So those are some of the key issues, and to keep trying to push out and then demobilize some of the Shia militia forces operating in the country right now, which I think is really counterproductive for U.S. interests.
Well, so in a way, it's a counterforce, would be a counterforce, at least politically, not militarily, politically, to Iranian influence in Iraq. And I assume maybe a balancing role politically. You've got the Kurds in the north, you've got the Shiites in the south and the east, and then you have the Sunnis. So there's a kind of a political balancing role here, too.
Yeah, I think there is a clear political balancing role. The Kurds in the north have generally been pretty effective over the long run in taking care of their own security. I think the balance there is a growing interest in broader Kurdish independence, linking up with Kurdish units in Syria and Turkey. Slightly different struggle than the Sunni fight down in Anbar. So there are multiple political issues the U.S. is going to have to balance.
All right. Thank you very much, Seth Jones, for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul.